when the wildfire roared through our quiet LA neighborhood. Felt like we had already lost everything: homes, memories, and hope. But as the flames closed in and chaos took over, a man in a black jacket emerged from the smoke. At first, we didn't know who he was. By the time the fire subsided, we knew he was the reason we were still standing, and no one could have guessed it was Keanu Reeves. It was a day that began with quiet unease, a smoky horizon and the distant hum of evacuation alerts. Most of the neighborhood had fled, leaving behind empty streets and a haunting silence. I stayed, unsure if it was stubbornness or fear of the unknown that kept me rooted in place. The fire had been a distant threat, a glowing orange line on the hills, until the wind turned. Suddenly, it wasn't a distant problem, it was at our doorstep. The sirens were too far, the fire too close, and we were on our own. And that's when we saw him, stepping calmly through the ash-filled air like a figure from a dream. No words, no introduction, just a quiet confidence that pulled us all together in the face of disaster. What happened next would become the story of a lifetime, a tale of bravery, humanity, and a man whose quiet heroism reminded us all of the power of kindness in our darkest hour. The moment he appeared, everything shifted. The fear that had paralyzed us began to loosen its grip, replaced by a cautious determination. The man in the black jacket didn't shout or demand attention. He simply looked at us, his eyes calm, yet commanding, and asked, "What can I do to help?" It was chaos all around. The fire had overtaken 3 houses already, and the wind was pushing it closer with terrifying speed. Smoke choked the air, and the orange glow in the distance was now a full-blown inferno. Yet, somehow, his presence steadied us. Without hesitation, he ran toward an elderly woman who was struggling to move, lifting her with a gentleness that belied the urgency of the moment. He carried her to safety as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Before I dive deeper into what happened next and reveal how this one man united a fractured community, I want to connect with all of you watching. Where are you tuning in from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you believe that ordinary people can become extraordinary heroes in the face of adversity, hit that like button, because this story is about to show you just how powerful humanity can be. With his guidance, we quickly transformed into a team. Someone brought water from a nearby garden hose. Another neighbor scavenged for first aid kits and blankets. It was as if he had flipped a switch in all of us, turning panic into purpose. And then the first major test came. From the far end of the street, we heard desperate cries for help. A young mother was standing outside her home, clutching her 2 children. Her car stalled in the driveway. The fire was closing in fast, and her terror was palpable. Without a word, the man sprinted toward her, waving for us to follow. Together, we pushed her car into motion and steered her toward the evacuation route. It wasn't until she and her children were safely on their way that he turned back to us, his voice firm but encouraging. "We can do this," he said. "No one gets left behind." And so we didn't stop. Under his quiet leadership, we worked through the choking smoke and blistering heat, pulling people, pets, and precious belongings from homes that would soon be reduced to ash. Every moment felt like a gamble against time, but somehow, we started to believe we could win. As the night wore on and the flames crept ever closer, one question lingered in the back of my mind. Who was this man? He worked tirelessly, never stopping to catch his breath or accept a word of thanks. His focus was unshakable, his resolve unyielding, and yet, he blended in like he'd been part of our neighborhood all along. What came next would cement him as a hero in all our eyes. But for now, all we knew was that, thanks to him, we were no longer running from the fire. We were standing our ground, saving one another, and proving that even in the darkest of times, hope can still burn bright. The fire wasn't just a threat anymore, it was here. Within minutes, the flames had leapt over the hills, roaring like a living beast hungry for destruction. The heat was suffocating, pressing down on us like an invisible weight. Thick, black smoke billowed through the streets, turning day into an ominous twilight. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet stayed rooted to the ground as chaos unfolded around me. From across the street, I saw a young family frantically loading their car. The mother's hands trembled as she buckled her toddler into the back seat, while the father wrestled with boxes of belongings, his face streaked with soot. Their car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered weakly, drowning out their rising panic. "Help!" the mother screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the fire. Without hesitation, I ran toward them, the heat from the advancing flames searing my skin. Before I could reach them, the man in the black jacket was already there. His movements were swift and purposeful, as if he'd done this 100 times before. "Pop the hood," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the chaos. The father obeyed, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the latch. The man worked quickly, his fingers moving with precision. Within moments, the car roared to life. "Go!" he shouted, stepping back as the family piled in. The mother glanced at him, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face. "Thank you," she whispered before the car sped down the street, disappearing into the smoke. That was the first of many rescues. The fire moved with terrifying speed, devouring everything in its path. It wasn't just homes, trees, fences, and memories burned together, leaving nothing but ash. The air was filled with a deafening cacophony of crackling wood, distant screams, and the relentless roar of the flames. The man in the black jacket didn't pause. He moved from house to house, checking for anyone left behind. "We need to organize," he said, his voice cutting through the panic. His calm authority was magnetic, pulling us all together. Under his guidance, we formed a team. Someone grabbed buckets of water from a neighbor's pool. Another neighbor, barely able to stand from fear just moments ago, now handed out masks and first aid supplies. The man gave instructions like a seasoned leader, but there was no time to question his experience. Every second counted. In the middle of it all, I saw him dash into a smoke-filled house. My breath caught as I watched him disappear into the fiery haze. Moments later, he emerged carrying a limp golden retriever, its fur singed but its eyes blinking with life. The dog's owner, a tearful elderly man, reached out to take his beloved pet. "You saved him," the man stammered, his voice breaking. The stranger simply nodded, a faint smile flickering across his face before he turned back to the task at hand. Each act of bravery sparked something in the rest of us. People who had been frozen in fear began moving with purpose. A neighbor I barely knew offered her car to transport supplies. Another man ran toward the fire with a shovel, determined to help create a firebreak. It was as if the stranger's courage was contagious, igniting a collective strength we didn't know we had. Then came the worst moment of the night. From the far end of the street, we heard faint screams and the frantic barking of a dog. A family was still trapped in their house, their path to safety cut off by a wall of flames. "We have to do something," someone shouted, but the fire was too intense, and the firefighters hadn't arrived yet. No one dared to move, no one except him. The man didn't hesitate. He grabbed a wet blanket from one of the aid stations we'd set up and sprinted toward the inferno. "Wait!" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear, but he was already inside. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The fire roared louder, and the house began to collapse under its weight. Just as we feared the worst, he emerged from the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the flames. In his arms, he carried a small girl, her face buried against his chest. Beside him, a scrappy terrier darted out, barking wildly. The crowd erupted into cheers as he handed the girl to her parents. The mother clutched her child tightly, sobbing uncontrollably. The father, his voice choked with gratitude, could only manage a whispered, "Thank you." The man in the black jacket didn't stop to bask in the moment. Instead, he turned back to us, his face smeared with ash but his eyes burning with determination. "We're not done yet," he said, and we weren't. With his leadership, We continued to fight the fire with everything we had, saving what we could, rescuing who we could. Through the chaos, he was our anchor, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, there was still hope. By the time the fire began to retreat, we were exhausted but resolute. Together, we had faced the flames and refused to give in. And at the center of it all was the man who had brought us together, a stranger whose courage had sparked our own. He was unlike anyone I had ever met. The man in the black jacket seemed to exist outside the chaos, unaffected by the panic that consumed the rest of us. There was no hesitation in his movements, no trace of fear in his expression. He acted with the precision of someone who had seen this kind of devastation before, someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. It wasn't long before he became the unofficial leader of our ragtag group of neighbors. He didn't bark orders or demand attention. He simply stepped in where he was needed most, when someone froze in fear. He was there with a steadying hand on their shoulder and a quiet, "You've got this," when the weight of the moment felt unbearable. His calm presence reminded us to breathe. We quickly learned that he wasn't just fearless, he was relentless. One moment, he was pulling an elderly woman out of a smoke-filled house. The next, he was helping a neighbor organize supplies into an impromptu aid station. He moved as though time itself were bending to his will, ensuring that every second was used to save another life, protect another home. As the night wore on, the fire pushed closer, its roar growing louder and more menacing. The heat was unbearable, and the air was thick with smoke. But the man never faltered. He had an uncanny ability to inspire confidence in the rest of us, to make us believe that we could do the impossible. At one point, we faced an overwhelming challenge. A nearby home had caught fire, and the family inside was too afraid to leave. Flames licked at the edges of their property, and the roof began to sag under the heat. The man in the black jacket didn't waste a second. He walked straight up to the front door, his voice calm but firm as he called out, "You need to come with me, now." When the family hesitated, he softened his tone, crouching down to meet their frightened eyes. "I know you're scared," he said, "but you have to trust me. We can rebuild what's lost. But I can't rebuild you." His words cut through their fear like a lifeline, and within moments, they were following him to safety. It wasn't just his bravery that stood out. It was his humanity. He didn't treat us like strangers or neighbors. He treated us like family. When someone faltered, he was there to lift them up. When tempers flared in the heat of the moment, he diffused them with a few kind words. He had an innate ability to see what each person needed and to give it freely. Without hesitation, I watched as he comforted a little boy who had lost his beloved cat in the chaos. The boy's tear-streaked face lit up when the man promised to find the pet. And sure enough, within an hour, he emerged from a smoky house with the frightened animal cradled in his arms. "You kept your promise," the boy whispered, his voice filled with awe. The man simply smiled and handed the cat over. But it wasn't just the small acts of kindness that left an impression. It was the way he brought us all together. Under his leadership, we became a team. We weren't just individuals fighting to save our own homes. We were a community, united by a shared purpose. He gave us hope when it felt like there was none left to find. At one point, I overheard a conversation between him and one of the firefighters who had finally arrived to assist. The firefighter, a grizzled veteran with years of experience, shook his head in amazement. "You've done more here in a few hours than most people could do in a week," he said. "Where'd you learn to handle yourself like this?" The man just shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I've been through a few fires before," he said simply, as though that explained everything. It wasn't until much later that we began to piece together who he really was. The calm demeanor, the quiet strength, the unmistakable air of someone who had lived through more than his fair share of hardships. It all pointed to a man who had spent his life giving more than he took. For hours, he worked tirelessly alongside us, never asking for recognition or praise. When someone offered him water, He took a quick sip and passed the rest to a neighbor in need. When he finally sat down for a moment's rest, he used the time to reassure a frightened child or help a volunteer plan the next steps. And then there was the moment that cemented his place in our hearts forever. The fire had reached the edge of our makeshift aid station, and we were running out of time. In the chaos, a small girl had gone missing. Her parents were frantic, searching desperately through the smoke-filled streets. She was playing by the swings. Her mother sobbed, clutching a blanket as though it could somehow bring her daughter back. Without a word, the man in the black jacket took off toward the park. The fire was raging now, the flames reaching higher with every passing second. We waited, our hearts in our throats, as the minutes ticked by. When he reappeared, he was carrying the little girl in his arms, her face buried against his chest. Behind him, the fire roared, consuming the swings where she had been moments earlier. He didn't say a word as he handed her to her parents, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. That night, as the flames began to die down and the first light of dawn broke through the smoky haze, he disappeared as quietly as he had arrived. No one saw him leave, but his impact was undeniable. Even now, as I think back on that night, I can't fully explain how one man managed to bring so much hope to a place consumed by despair. But I do know this: heroes aren't always the ones who seek the spotlight. Sometimes, they're the ones who step into the fire, not for glory, but because they simply can't stand to do nothing. And that man, the one who saved lives, inspired courage, and reminded us of what it means to be human, was Keanu Reeves. The moment he handed the little girl back to her parents, something shifted in all of us. It wasn't just relief or gratitude. It was a newfound resolve. Watching this man face the flames with nothing but sheer determination and a calm that felt almost otherworldly made us believe that we, too, could do more. His courage wasn't just inspiring, it was contagious. First, it was subtle. A neighbor who had been too paralyzed by fear to leave her front yard suddenly volunteered to organize supplies at the aid station. Another, who had been sitting silently by the curb, stood up and began helping move water and blankets closer to where they were needed. It was as though his bravery had lit a spark in all of us, igniting a chain reaction of action and hope. Keanu, though we still didn't know who he was at the time, seemed to sense this shift. He didn't pause to take credit or even acknowledge the transformation he had sparked. Instead, he used the momentum to keep us moving forward. "We've got this," he said, his voice steady and encouraging. "Just keep going." And we did. One by one, people began stepping into roles they hadn't imagined themselves capable of. A teenager who had been sheltering in her car emerged with her phone, using it to communicate with emergency services and provide updates on the fire's progress. An elderly man who had initially refused to evacuate began guiding his neighbors to safer areas, his cane tapping steadily on the ash-covered ground. Even I, who had started the day feeling helpless and unsure, found myself running alongside Keanu, helping to evacuate families and pets from homes that were on the brink of destruction. I had never felt more exhausted or more alive. The turning point came when we heard a faint cry for help coming from a house at the far end of the street. The fire had engulfed most of the surrounding area, and the structure looked precarious, its roof sagging under the weight of the heat. For a moment, no one moved. The risk was too great. But Keanu didn't hesitate. "We're going in," he said, glancing at me and a few others who had been working closely with him. His calm confidence left no room for doubt. And before I could second-guess myself, I was following him toward the house. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, and the heat was suffocating. Visibility was almost non-existent, but Keanu moved with purpose, his hand gripping a flashlight that cut through the darkness. "Over here," he called, his voice strong despite the choking conditions. We found an elderly couple huddled in a corner, clutching a photo album and a small suitcase. They were reluctant to leave, their fear of losing their memories outweighing their concern for their safety. Keanu crouched down in front of them, his voice gentle but firm. "I understand," he said, But your memories live in here, he added, tapping his chest. Not in these things. We need to get you out of here so you can make more memories. His words broke through their hesitation, and they nodded, allowing us to help them to their feet. As we led them out of the house, Keanu grabbed the photo album from the floor, tucking it under his arm. Some things are worth saving, he said with a small smile. By the time we emerged, the fire had crept dangerously close. The heat was almost unbearable, and the smoke stung my eyes, but we managed to get the couple to safety. The neighbors who had gathered cheered as the couple embraced, their tears a mix of gratitude and relief. The domino effect continued to ripple through the crowd. People who had once been frozen in fear were now moving with purpose, each inspired by the example set by this quiet, unassuming man. Someone brought out a makeshift stretcher for an injured neighbor. Another neighbor, who had been reluctant to help at first, offered her truck to transport supplies to the firefighters who were battling the blaze on the front lines. Keanu remained at the center of it all, not as a leader barking orders, but as a steady presence who reminded us all of what we were capable of. His words were simple but powerful. You're stronger than you think. We're in this together. Every little bit helps. And then came the most dramatic moment of the night. A firefighter ran up to us, his face streaked with soot and worry. There's a family trapped at the top of the hill, he said. The road's blocked, and we can't get our trucks through. The group hesitated. The fire at the top of the hill was raging, and the path to reach it was treacherous. But Keanu stepped forward without hesitation. Let's go, he said, looking directly at me and a few others. The climb was grueling. The smoke was so thick that every breath felt like fire in my lungs, and the heat was oppressive. But Keanu led the way, his determination unwavering. When we finally reached the house, we found a family of 4, 2 parents and their twin boys huddled together, their faces streaked with soot and fear. Keanu quickly assessed the situation, directing us to help the parents while he carried one of the boys in his arms. The other clung to his brother's hand, his small face buried against his shoulder. We're going to get you out of here, Keanu said, his voice calm and reassuring. The descent was even more harrowing than the climb, but somehow, we made it. By the time we reached the bottom, the entire neighborhood had gathered, their cheers ringing out as we emerged from the smoke. The family was safe, and for the first time that night, felt like we might actually win this fight. As I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, exhausted, covered in ash, but united in their determination, I realized that something extraordinary had happened. We had started the night as strangers, each consumed by our own fear and uncertainty. But now, we were a community, bound together by the courage of one man who had refused to let us give up. Keanu didn't stop. Even as the fire began to die down and the worst of the danger passed, he kept moving, helping where he could and offering words of encouragement to those who needed it most. He was tireless, selfless, and utterly unforgettable. By the time dawn broke, the fire had finally been contained. The damage was devastating, but the spirit of the community was unshaken. And at the heart of it all was the man in the black jacket, whose bravery and kindness had sparked a domino effect of heroism that none of us would ever forget. The fire was relentless. Even as dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight pierced through the smoky haze, it seemed the flames had no intention of giving up. The firefighters were pushing back with everything they had, but the inferno kept advancing, consuming everything in its path. What little hope we'd clung to through the night was starting to waver. For a brief moment, we thought we might have done all we could. Most of the neighborhood had been evacuated, and those who remained had banded together to fight for what little could still be saved. Supplies were running low, and exhaustion was written on every soot-streaked face. But then we heard it. Faint screams carried on the wind, coming from the far edge of the neighborhood. It was a house we hadn't yet reached, isolated at the top of a hill that was now surrounded by flames. The family inside hadn't been accounted for, and their cries for help pierced through the thick. oppressive air like a desperate plea. "We need to get to them," someone said, their voice trembling with fear. But the road leading up to the house was blocked by fallen debris, and the flames were spreading too quickly for the fire trucks to make it through. Keanu stepped forward, his face calm but resolute. "We'll go on foot," he said, his voice steady despite the danger that loomed ahead. The group hesitated. The flames were closer than ever, and the hill was steep, its terrain treacherous under layers of ash and burning debris. But Keanu's determination was unshakable. "Every second counts," he said, his eyes scanning the group. "If we don't go now, they won't make it." His words cut through the fear like a lifeline. Slowly, a few of us nodded, stepping forward to join him. I was one of them, though my legs felt like lead and my heart pounded in my chest. We moved quickly, the heat pressing against us like a physical force. The smoke was so thick that it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead, and every breath burned in my lungs. Keanu led the way, his movements deliberate and focused. He didn't slow down, didn't falter, even as the flames closed in around us. When we finally reached the house, the scene was worse than we had imagined. The flames were licking at the edges of the property, and the roof was already smoldering. Inside, we could hear the muffled cries of the family, a mother, father, and their teenage son, trapped with no way out. Keanu didn't hesitate. "We're getting them out," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. He turned to me and the others. "We'll split up. 2 of you check the back for another exit. The rest of us will go through the front." The door was hot to the touch, but Keanu kicked it open with a strength that seemed impossible for one man. The smoke inside was suffocating, but he pushed forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Over here," the father called, his voice strained. They were huddled in a corner of the living room, clutching each other as the fire crept closer. Keanu reached them first, crouching down to assess their condition. The mother was coughing uncontrollably, and the son's eyes were wide with fear. "We're going to get you out," Keanu said firmly. "Stay close to me." He lifted the mother into his arms without hesitation, motioning for the father to help his son. "Follow me," he said, his voice calm but commanding. The way out was treacherous. Flames had already consumed part of the staircase, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. The air was so thick with smoke that it was hard to breathe. But Keanu never slowed down. He moved with purpose, guiding the family through the burning house like he had done this 1,000 times before. Just as we reached the front door, there was a loud crack, and part of the ceiling collapsed behind us. The father stumbled, his son crying out as he tried to pull him forward. Without a word, Keanu handed the mother to me and turned back, gripping the father's arm and pulling him to safety. We emerged from the house just as the roof gave way, flames consuming what was left of the structure. The family clung to each other, their sobs muffled by the roar of the fire. But Keanu wasn't finished. He turned to the father, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "Is there anyone else inside?" The man shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, it's just us," he said. Keanu nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time. "Then let's get you out of here." The journey back down the hill was harrowing. The fire had spread even further, and the heat was unbearable. But Keanu's presence was like an anchor, keeping us grounded even as the world seemed to collapse around us. By the time we reached the bottom, the neighborhood had gathered, their faces filled with a mix of fear and hope. When they saw us emerge from the smoke, carrying the family to safety, a wave of relief washed over the crowd. There were cheers, tears, and murmurs of disbelief as the family was reunited with friends and neighbors. The mother clung to Keanu, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You saved us. Thank you." He simply nodded, his face calm but weary. "Just doing what needed to be done," he said, his voice quiet. As the firefighters finally gained control of the blaze, the neighborhood began to breathe again. The flames that had once seemed unstoppable were finally subdued. leaving behind a trail of destruction, but also a community that had found strength in the unlikeliest of places. Keanu didn't stay to bask in the gratitude or praise that poured out from those he had helped. Instead, he quietly stepped back, his work done. As he disappeared into the crowd, I realized something. This wasn't just a man who had stepped up in a moment of crisis. This was someone who had reminded us all of the best parts of humanity: courage, kindness, and an unshakable belief that even in the darkest moments, we can make a difference. That day, the fire took so much from us. But thanks to Keanu, it also gave us something we'll never forget: hope. And as I looked at the faces of my neighbors, exhausted, soot-covered, but unbroken, I knew we were all better for having stood together. Led by a man who showed us what it truly means to be a hero. The fire was finally out. After what felt like an eternity, the relentless flames had been subdued, leaving behind a neighborhood cloaked in smoke and ash. The once vibrant streets were now lined with charred trees and rubble, the remnants of homes reduced to skeletal frames. Yet, amidst the devastation, there was a profound sense of relief. We had survived. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the smoky haze, neighbors began emerging from their makeshift shelters, their faces etched with exhaustion but also a quiet resilience. People hugged, some sobbing into each other's shoulders, while others simply stood in silence, taking in the surreal scene. The air was heavy with the smell of soot and loss. But there was something else, something unspoken but deeply felt: gratitude. At the center of it all was Keanu. He wasn't standing in the spotlight, nor was he seeking recognition for what he had done. Instead, he was quietly moving among the crowd, handing out bottles of water, offering comforting words, and helping to clear debris. His jacket was streaked with ash, his face lined with fatigue, but his presence remained steady and unyielding, just as it had been throughout the night. I watched as he knelt beside an elderly man who had lost his home. The man clutched a singed photograph, his hands trembling. "It's all gone," he whispered, his voice breaking. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice low and reassuring. "Not everything," he said. "You're still here, and so are the people who care about you. That's what matters most." His words, simple but profound, seemed to resonate with everyone he spoke to. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it, with a sincerity that cut through the heaviness of the moment. He wasn't just helping us rebuild our neighborhood. He was helping us rebuild ourselves. As the morning wore on, more firefighters and emergency responders arrived, bringing additional supplies and support. They marveled at what had been accomplished overnight. Not just the lives saved, but the way the community had come together in the face of unimaginable adversity. One firefighter pulled Keanu aside, shaking his hand with a look of admiration. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but I've never seen anything like what you did here. You saved so many people." Keanu nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "It was all of us." And he was right. As I looked around, I saw a community that had been transformed. Neighbors who barely knew each other's names were now working side by side, clearing debris, comforting one another, and sharing stories of the night. The fear and uncertainty that had gripped us before had been replaced by something far more powerful: a sense of unity. By midday, the neighborhood had become a hive of activity. Makeshift aid stations were bustling with volunteers, offering food, water, and medical supplies to those in need. People who had lost everything were being comforted and supported by those who still had something to give. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and to the man who had inspired it. But as the day wore on, it became clear that Keanu wasn't planning to stay. He moved quietly through the crowd, avoiding the growing attention that was starting to surround him. When someone asked for his name, he deflected with a humble smile and a quick, "Just call me a neighbor." It wasn't until later, when one of the firefighters recognized him, that the truth began to spread. "That's Keanu Reeves," the firefighter said. his voice filled with awe. The actor. The revelation rippled through the crowd, sparking a mix of disbelief and admiration. Some people stared in shock, while others whispered excitedly. But when they turned to thank him, he was already walking away, his figure disappearing into the smoky distance. He left as quietly as he had come, slipping away without ceremony or fanfare. It was almost as if he wanted us to focus not on him, but on what we had accomplished together. In the days that followed, as the neighborhood began to recover, his actions became the stuff of legend. People shared stories of his bravery, his kindness, and his unshakable determination. But more than that, they spoke of the way he had brought us together, how he had shown us that even in the darkest moments, there is strength to be found in unity. For weeks, we worked to rebuild what the fire had taken. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the loss felt overwhelming. But every time it seemed like too much to bear, someone would remember something Keanu had said or done, and it would remind us of why we kept going. I often think back to that night, to the man in the black jacket who appeared when we needed him most. He didn't just save lives. He reminded us of what it means to truly live, to care for one another, to stand together in the face of adversity, and to find hope even in the ashes. And though he may have left without saying goodbye, his impact will never fade, because in our neighborhood, in the hearts of those he helped, Keanu Reeves will always be more than an actor. He will be a symbol of courage, compassion, and the quiet power of one person to make a difference. As the sun set over our slowly healing community, I stood among my neighbors, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. The fire may have taken so much, but it couldn't take away what mattered most. And for that, we had a man in a black jacket to thank. In the weeks that followed, the scars left by the fire were everywhere. Blackened tree stumps lined the streets. Charred rubble stood where homes had once been, and the air still carried the faint smell of smoke, a haunting reminder of what we had endured. But amid the destruction, there was life, there was hope. The neighborhood that had once felt fragmented and distant was now united in a way none of us could have imagined. People who had been little more than strangers were now friends, bound by the shared memory of a night when everything changed. The bonds formed in the heat of the fire held strong, as neighbors worked together to rebuild not just homes, but a sense of community. Every so often, someone would mention him, the man in the black jacket who had appeared out of the smoke and led us through our darkest hours. His name, now known to all of us, was spoken with reverence. Keanu Reeves. They would say, shaking their heads in amazement. Can you believe it? But it wasn't his fame that stayed with us. It was the man himself, his humility, his courage, and the way he had shown us what we were capable of when we stood together. For many, he was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable adversity, one person's actions could inspire a community to rise above fear. One day, as I stood in what was left of my front yard, sorting through a pile of salvaged belongings, I found myself thinking back to that night. The image of Keanu carrying the little girl out of the burning house was seared into my memory, as vivid as if it had happened just moments ago. It wasn't just the act itself that stayed with me. It was the look in his eyes, the quiet determination that said he wouldn't stop until everyone was safe. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the neighborhood, I looked around at the faces of my neighbors. Some were laughing, others were hard at work, but all of them carried the same unspoken understanding that we had been through something extraordinary together, and we had come out stronger because of it. In the distance, the faint sound of children's laughter echoed through the air. It was the kind of sound that might have gone unnoticed before, but now it felt like a victory. It was a sign that life was moving forward, that even in the face of loss, there was still so much to be grateful for. And then, as if on cue, I saw something that made me smile. On the horizon, a figure in a black jacket walked away from the neighborhood, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. It was impossible to tell if it was really him, or just my mind playing tricks on me. But in that moment, it didn't matter, because the truth was, Keanu Reeves didn't just leave an impression, he left a legacy. His actions that night had sparked something in all of us. Something that couldn't be extinguished even by the fiercest of fires. As I turned back to my work, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The fire had taken so much, but it had also given us something invaluable. It had shown us the power of unity, the strength of the human spirit, and the impact one person can have when they choose to step up and help. And so, as the light faded and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I whispered a quiet thank you to the man who reminded us of what it means to be a hero, and to the community that rose from the ashes, stronger and more connected than ever before. We would rebuild, we would heal, and we would carry the memory of that night with us, not as a story of loss, but as a testament to resilience, courage, and the enduring power of kindness. Because sometimes, heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes, they wear black jackets, step out of the smoke, and remind us all of what it means to truly care.